Can you imagine a world so sure of itself, so confident in its own progress, that it just sleepwalks right into a war that would end up devouring an entire generation? Well, that's what we're talking about today, the First World War. This wasn't just a conflict that redrew some maps. It literally shattered empires and completely reshaped the modern world as we know it.
Back in the summer of 1914, the thinking was that this would all be over in a few months. Millions of young men marched off, totally convinced they'd be back home with their families by Christmas. They couldn't have been more tragically wrong.
So how in the world does a single gunshot in a city in the Balkans ignite a global catastrophe? Well, it all starts with a continent that was basically a giant powder keg, covered in tripwires, just waiting for a spark.
Okay, so before the war, Europe was basically split into two big armed camps. You had the Triple Entente, that's France, Britain, and Russia, all kind of looking over their shoulder at Germany's growing power. And on the other side, you have the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Germany, for its part, was terrified of being surrounded. Now, these weren't just friendly agreements. These were solid, ironclad treaties that meant if one country went to war, their friends were automatically dragged in too.
The speed at which this all happened is just breathtaking. Okay, let's dive into this. It starts with the assassination of the Archduke. Then, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia, who's the big protector of Serbia, starts mobilizing its massive army. Germany sees that as a direct threat, so boom, they declare war on Russia. And since France is Russia's ally, Germany declares war on them too and invades through neutral Belgium. And that right there, invading Belgium, is the final straw that brings the mighty British Empire into the fight. In just over a month, all the dominoes had fallen. All of Europe was at war.
So Germany had this master plan for a quick knockout blow, the famous Schlieffen Plan. The idea was to crush France in just a few weeks. But that plan completely slammed into the brutal new reality of modern warfare.
See, the incredible destructive power of new weapons like machine guns and heavy artillery made the old way of fighting, charging across open ground, basically a death sentence. So the only way to survive was to dig, and they dug these horrifying, complex networks of trenches that stretched for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And that barren, terrifying wasteland between the two opposing trenches, it earned the perfect name, No Man's Land.
Over in the West, after Germany's big push was finally stopped just short of Paris, the front lines just locked in place. And that's where you get that bloody, grinding stalemate of the trenches. But out in the East, it was a totally different kind of war. The front was much more mobile, but it was just as deadly. Russia actually mobilized way faster than Germany thought they would, but their armies were absolutely crushed at the Battle of Tannenberg. It was a catastrophic loss, and one they really never recovered from.
And this is so important to remember. This was not just a European war. Not at all. Because of these huge colonial empires, the fighting went global almost immediately. You had battles breaking out in Africa and Asia. The Ottoman Empire jumped in, opening up whole new fronts in the Middle East. And naval battles were being fought in literally every ocean on the planet. It truly was a world war.
With no quick victory in sight, the generals on both sides settled on a new, unbelievably grim strategy. If you can't outsmart or outmaneuver the enemy, well, you'll just have to bleed them dry.
And this is where the war gets particularly horrifying. Winning wasn't about capturing territory anymore. No, it became about a monstrous calculation. Can we kill more of their soldiers than they kill of ours? The entire war devolved into this giant industrial meat grinder, a question of who would run out of men first.
And nowhere is this terrifying strategy more clear than in the massive, bloody battles of 1916. First up was the Battle of the Somme, a gigantic offensive launched by the British and the French.
Just look at that number, 57,000. That's not the total for the whole battle. That was the number of British casualties on the very first day. It is still the single deadliest day in the entire history of the British Army. An entire generation was literally being wiped out.
And at the exact same time, the French were locked in their own 10-month-long nightmare, a desperate defense of the fortress city of Verdun. The German goal there was stated pretty clearly, to bleed the French army white. But the French, under that defiant battle cry, "They shall not pass," they held on. But the cost for both sides was just catastrophic. By 1917, every country involved was stretched to its absolute breaking point. And this was the year the entire war pivoted. Two massive, game-changing events were about to happen that would change everything. So, 1917 brought two seismic shifts. First, Russia collapsed. Crushed by millions of casualties and with people starving back home, the country exploded into revolution. The new government pulled Russia right out of the war. But just as one great power was leaving the stage, another one was stepping on. Germany, desperate to break the British naval blockade, went back to unrestricted submarine warfare. That, plus a secret telegram they sent trying to get Mexico to attack the US, was the final push. America entered the war, bringing its incredible industrial power and millions of fresh troops to the Allied side.
With Russia out of the picture, Germany was able to shift 500,000 soldiers over to the Western Front. They knew they had a very, very small window of time to win the war before the full might of America could arrive. It was time for one last massive roll of the dice.
And Germany's big spring offensive came terrifyingly close to working. But in the end, it failed. And when the Allies, now boosted by fresh American troops, launched their own counterattack, the 100 Days Offensive, the German army just broke. They were exhausted, out of supplies, and demoralized. And then their allies started to fall, one by one. Until finally, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, Germany signed the armistice, and the guns finally fell silent.
But the end of the shooting was really just the start of a brand new, very uncertain chapter. The world that crawled out of the trenches was a fundamentally different and often tragically broken place.
The human cost is almost impossible to wrap your head around. 9.5 million soldiers killed, another 21 million wounded. Entire countries were just left in ruins. And politically, the war caused an earthquake. 4 huge, centuries-old empires simply ceased to exist. The German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Russian empires were all gone. And in their place, the maps of Europe and the Middle East were completely redrawn.
The peace treaty that was signed at Versailles was supposed to prevent another war like this from ever happening again. But a lot of people argue it did the exact opposite by being so incredibly harsh on Germany. The real kicker was the war guilt clause, which forced Germany to accept 100% of the blame for starting the war. That, plus crippling financial payments and a gutted military, created this deep, burning resentment that would poison German politics for years to come.
Which really leaves us with one last, chilling question. Instead of creating a lasting peace, did the war to end all wars and its flawed ending actually just sow the seeds for an even bigger, even more devastating conflict just 20 years down the road?